A crash landing into danger. Jake Carter's heart pounded as his ship spun out of control. Sparks flew from the control panel, and red warning lights flashed all around him. He gritted his teeth, trying to stabilize the craft, but the engines had failed. Gravity pulled him down, fast and unforgiving. Through the cockpit window, he saw nothing but thick, green jungle stretching for miles. "This is bad," he muttered. With a violent jolt, the ship crashed through the treetops, metal groaning as it tore through branches. The impact threw Jake forward, but his harness held him in place. The ship slammed into the ground, skidding through dirt and foliage before coming to a shaky stop. For a moment, everything was silent except for his own heavy breathing. He unbuckled himself, wincing at the pain in his ribs. The cockpit was filled with smoke, and the smell of burning wires stung his nose. He grabbed his emergency bag, kicked open the hatch, and stumbled out into the unknown world. The air was thick and humid. Strange bird-like creatures shrieked in the distance. Towering trees loomed over him, their vines twisting like snakes. The jungle floor was damp, and he could feel unseen insects crawling nearby. "All right, first things first," he thought. "Check supplies, fix the ship, get the hell out of here." But just as he turned back toward his wrecked craft, he felt eyes watching him. Jake's muscles tensed. Slowly, he reached for the small survival knife strapped to his leg. The jungle was too quiet now. Even the birds had stopped making noise. Then they came. Dark shapes moved between the trees. Tall, muscular figures with war paint streaked across their faces. They had sharp bone weapons, and their piercing yellow eyes glowed under the jungle's dim light. Jake raised his hands in a cautious gesture. "I don't want trouble," he said. The aliens didn't care. One of them let out a deep, guttural roar, and before Jake could react, a net flew through the air, wrapping tightly around him. He struggled, but the more he moved, the tighter it became. His knife fell from his grip. "Great," he muttered. "This just keeps getting better." The aliens surrounded him, their faces unreadable. One of them, clearly the leader, stepped forward. He was larger than the others, with a necklace made of sharp teeth. He stared at Jake for a long moment, then turned to his warriors. He raised his weapon and spoke in a deep, booming voice. "Tonight, we feast on the outsider." The aliens let out wild cheers, beating their weapons against the ground. Jake's stomach twisted. Did he just say feast? That meant only one thing. They weren't taking him prisoner. They were taking him as food. The warriors lifted him off the ground, still trapped in the net, and began marching through the jungle. Jake struggled, but their grip was like iron. He could see flickering lights in the distance. A village. As they arrived, the tribe erupted into celebration. Fires burned high, casting long shadows. Drums pounded in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat. Alien children ran around, laughing and pointing at him. The smell of roasting meat filled the air, and Jake had a terrible feeling he was next on the menu. They carried him to a large wooden altar in the center of the village. A massive stone blade rested beside it. The leader raised his hands, signaling the crowd to silence. "This is it," Jake thought. "I'm about to be dinner." But then she appeared. A tall alien woman stepped forward, dressed in long, flowing robes. Unlike the warriors, she wore no armor and carried no weapons. Instead, strange symbols were painted on her skin, glowing faintly in the firelight. Her eyes locked onto Jake's, and something shifted in the air. She raised a hand, and the entire village fell silent. Even the warriors stepped back, lowering their weapons. The priestess spoke, her voice soft yet powerful. Not food, but fate. Jake's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? The tribal leader frowned. He is an outsider. He must be sacrificed. The priestess shook her head. He is not food. A deep tension filled the air. The warriors exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody wanted to go against the priestess, but they also didn't want to disobey their leader. Finally, After a long, heavy pause, the leader growled, "Then he is yours, Priestess. But if he brings doom upon us, it will be your fault." Jake didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more worried. He wasn't dinner, but now he was something else. Something important. The priestess stepped closer, leaning down so only he could hear. Her voice was a whisper. "You must escape, or all will die." A deep guttural growl echoed from the jungle. Something big was coming. The priestess's warning. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the village as the aliens celebrated their near feast. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat, but Jake Carter knew he had almost been on that fire. His wrists ached from the rough bindings, and his body was still sore from the crash. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was her, the priestess who had just saved him. She stood before him, tall and regal, with dark markings glowing faintly on her skin. Unlike the others, she carried no weapons, but her presence commanded silence. Even the towering warriors seemed uncertain around her. She had spoken for him, claimed him, and for now, that had kept him alive. But why? The tribal leader, still gripping his massive spear, glared at her. "He is an outsider," he growled. "A curse." The priestess's yellow eyes locked onto him. "He is fate." A tense silence followed. The warriors exchanged glances, their hands tightening around their bone weapons. They didn't understand, and neither did Jake. But the priestess did not back down. "He stays with me," she declared. The leader's lips curled, but after a long pause he nodded. "Then he is your burden. If the gods reject him, it will be your mistake." With that, he turned and stormed off, leaving the warriors to disperse. The drumming slowly resumed, and the village returned to its feast. Jake, still trapped in the crude wooden cage, exhaled. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't free either. A mysterious ally. Hours passed. The celebration continued, but no one paid attention to him anymore. Jake sat in the cage, watching, waiting, thinking. Then, at last, she returned. The priestess moved like a shadow, silent yet sure-footed. She knelt beside his cage, studying him with those unreadable golden eyes. "You understand words?" she asked in broken English. Jake blinked. "You speak English." The priestess frowned, as if the words were strange on her tongue. "I'd learn. From Skyfallen." Jake's heart pounded. Skyfallen. Were there others like him before? "What do you mean?" he asked. "Who else landed here?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Before. Long ago." Jake swallowed hard. That meant he wasn't the first human to crash on this planet. But if others had come before, where were they now? Before he could ask, she glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching. Then she pressed her hand against the cage lock and whispered something in her own language. The wooden bars creaked, and suddenly the lock snapped open. Jake stared. "How did you?" She pressed a finger to her lips. "No time. You must go." Jake hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" Her expression darkened. "Because if you stay, all will die." A deep rumbling growl echoed through the trees. Jake's body stiffened. That sound was not human. It wasn't even alien in the way the tribe was. It was something else. Something big. The priestess clenched her jaw. "It comes." She grabbed his arm and pulled him up. "Move." Jake didn't argue. His instincts screamed that whatever was coming was far worse than being captured again. He followed her through the darkness, weaving between the huts as the villagers continued their feast, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the firelight. The monster in the dark. They reached the edge of the village, where the jungle swallowed all light. The priestess paused, turning to him. "You go," she whispered. "Run far." Jake frowned. "What about you?" She hesitated. "I stop it. I try." Jake narrowed his eyes. "You just saved me from being dinner. Now you want me to leave while you fight some. thing alone. The growl came again, closer this time. The trees trembled. The priestess grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Her glowing markings pulsed, and her voice was sharp. You do not understand. If it sees you, it will hunt. Always. Forever. Jake swallowed hard. And what is it exactly? Her expression was grim. The gorgal. A crash thundered through the jungle. Branches snapped like twigs. A massive shadow moved in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. Jake's breath hitched. He couldn't see it clearly, but he could feel it. The air was thick with the weight of something ancient, something unnatural. The village finally noticed. The drumming stopped. Warriors turned, their faces pale. Then, a single golden eye glowed in the dark. The jungle erupted into chaos. The gorgal charged, bursting through the trees with terrifying speed. Warriors shouted, grabbing their weapons, but it was too fast, too strong. Jake barely had time to register what he was looking at. A beast unlike anything on Earth. Massive claws. Thick, black armor-like skin. Rows of razor-sharp teeth. The warriors attacked, throwing spears, but the weapons bounced off. The beast swatted a warrior aside, sending him flying like a ragdoll. Jake's pulse exploded. We have to go, he shouted. The priestess didn't move. Instead, she raised her hands, and the glowing markings on her skin flared brighter. Jake had no idea what she was doing, but whatever it was their only chance. The gorgal roared, loud enough to shake the ground. Then it locked eyes with Jake. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what pure primal terror felt like. The real threat emerges. A low, guttural snarl echoed through the trees, making the very ground beneath Jake's feet tremble. He had faced death before. Crashes, fires, even an alien tribe that nearly roasted him alive. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This was something primal, something buried deep in his instincts, a warning older than time itself. Run. But he couldn't move. The gorgal stepped out of the jungle's shadows, its massive body blocking out the moonlight. Its thick, black armor-like hide gleamed under the fire's glow. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto Jake, and its long, serrated teeth dripped with thick saliva. Jake had seen predators before. Lions, bears, wolves. This wasn't like them. This thing wasn't just a hunter. It was a force of nature. The village exploded into chaos. Warriors grabbed their weapons, shouting orders. Women and children screamed, running for shelter. The drummers abandoned their instruments, and the sound of frantic footsteps filled the air. But the priestess didn't move. Her glowing markings pulsed brighter, and she slowly raised her hands toward the sky. She whispered something in her language, a prayer. A spell. Jake had no idea. The gorgal lunged forward, its monstrous claws tearing into the nearest hut, ripping it apart like paper. Jake barely had time to react before the priestess grabbed his arm and hissed, "Move." Finally, his body obeyed. They ran. A desperate escape. The jungle closed in around them, vines and branches flashing against Jake's skin as he sprinted after the priestess. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and something else. Blood. Behind them, the village was in chaos. Warriors fought bravely, but their weapons barely scratched the beast's hide. The gorgal didn't hunt for food. It hunted because it could. Jake risked a glance over his shoulder, and his stomach dropped. The beast had ignored the villagers. It was chasing him. Jake's pulse pounded. What the hell? Why is it after me? The priestess didn't stop running, but she shouted over her shoulder, "It has your scent now. You are prey." Jake cursed. Fantastic. The jungle floor sloped downward, and suddenly they were running through a deep ravine, surrounded by massive roots twisting through the earth. Jake's boots slipped on the damp ground, but he forced himself forward. The priestess darted ahead, surprisingly fast. Her robe barely brushed against the leaves, while Jake crashed through the undergrowth like a wild animal. The gorgal was gaining on them. A deep snarl erupted behind him, and Jake felt a gust of hot, foul-smelling breath on his back. Too close. Too damn close. Then, suddenly, the priestess skidded to a stop. Jake nearly collided into her. "Why the hell did you?" She grabbed him, her fingers digging into his arms, and whispered, "Do not move." Jake's chest heaved, his lungs burning. He wanted to scream that stopping was the worst idea ever, but then he saw her eyes. They weren't afraid. They were focused, calculating. She lifted her hands again, her glowing symbols pulsing. A strange humming filled the air, like the deep vibration of a distant storm. Then, silence. No rustling leaves, no distant screams, no pounding footsteps. The gorgal was gone. Jake's breath was shallow. He turned, slowly, expecting the monster to pounce. Nothing. What the hell just happened?" he whispered. The priestess exhaled. "It does not see. It does not hear. It only hunts by motion." Jake's blood ran cold. That thing, it wasn't hunting by sound or sight. It was hunting by movement. If they had kept running, they would already be dead. A tribe living in fear. The jungle remained deathly quiet for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the priestess lowered her hands, and the glowing symbols on her skin faded. Jake exhaled a shaky breath. "You could have told me that earlier." The priestess ignored his sarcasm. "We must keep moving. It will return." She led him deeper into the jungle, carefully stepping over vines and avoiding open spaces. Jake followed, his mind still racing. Why had the beast ignored the villagers? Why him? And what the hell were those glowing marks on her skin? Minutes passed before they arrived at a hidden cave, its entrance covered by thick vines. The priestess motioned for Jake to enter first. Inside, the space was cool and dimly lit by strange blue crystals embedded in the walls. Old clay pots, bones, and carvings covered the ground. Jake's gaze landed on one particular carving, and his breath caught. It was the gorgal. But the image showed more than just the beast. Surrounding it were dozens of human-like figures, all bowing before it. Jake turned to the priestess. "What the hell is this?" She stared at the carving, her expression unreadable. The truth. The horrifying truth. Jake ran a hand through his damp hair, his heart still racing. "Okay, explain. Why is that thing chasing me?" The priestess sat beside a small stone altar, tracing her fingers over an old inscription. "It is not chasing you. It is hunting what you are." Jake frowned. "What I am?" She finally looked at him. "A skyfallen." Jake stiffened. "The last one," she continued, "was long ago. He tried to fight the gorgal. He failed." Jake's stomach twisted. He turned back to the carving, his eyes scanning the ancient figures. That wasn't just a random group of victims bowing before the beast. It was his people. Humans. The realization hit him like a freight train. This thing, it doesn't just hunt. It hunts humans. The priestess nodded. "It is why the tribe fears you." Jake stared at the carving, the horrifying weight of truth sinking in. He wasn't just unlucky. He wasn't just a random target. He was part of something far bigger than he understood. The gorgal had been waiting for him, and it wouldn't stop hunting until he was dead. The hunt begins. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the cave walls as Jake stared at the ancient carvings. His mind was racing. The gorgal wasn't just a predator. It was something older, something tied to humans. He had seen creatures hunt for food before, but this was different. This thing hunted him. He turned toward the priestess, still sitting near the altar, her golden eyes locked onto the markings. She had saved him, led him here. But why? Jake exhaled sharply. "You said the last human tried to fight it. What happened to him?" The priestess ran her fingers over the stone, tracing the carved image of the gorgal. "He was strong, brave, but not enough." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "And now it's my turn." She nodded. Jake cursed under his breath and paced. He was a pilot, an explorer, not some warrior in an alien deathmatch. Great. So, what? I'm supposed to fight an unstoppable killing machine. The priestess stood, her glowing tattoos dimming slightly. Not fight. Win. Jake let out a hollow laugh. Oh, sure. Just win against a monster the size of a tank. The priestess narrowed her eyes. The sky fallen before you fought alone. She stepped closer. You will not. Jake blinked. Wait, you're saying you'll help. She inclined her head. And the tribe, if they believe. Jake frowned. The same tribe that almost ate him for dinner. Yeah, not exactly his biggest fans. But before he could argue, the ground shook. A deep, unnatural growl echoed through the jungle, distant yet too close for comfort. Jake froze. The priestess's expression darkened. It hunts. Jake took a slow breath. Yeah, no kidding. She turned toward the cave entrance. Come. We must return. Jake hesitated. Return. To the village. The same people who wanted to roast me. She faced him. If they do not stand, they will fall. Jake stared at her. This was her home, her people. She was willing to fight for them, even if they feared her. Something in his chest tightened. He couldn't walk away. With a slow exhale, he clenched his fists. All right, let's go. Back to the tribe. By the time they reached the outskirts of the village, the smell of smoke was thick in the air. Fires still burned, and the sound of mournful wailing drifted between the huts. Jake's stomach twisted. The gorgal had already been here. The tribal leader stood near the center of the village, a deep scowl on his face as warriors dragged away the remains of shattered huts. The survivors gathered around, their faces a mix of anger and fear. When they saw Jake and the priestess, the mood shifted. Whispers spread. Some warriors raised their weapons, but no one moved forward. Then the leader stepped closer, his yellow eyes burning with fury. You have brought this upon us, priestess. The priestess did not flinch. The gorgal would have come, whether he was here or not. The leader growled. The outsider must be sacrificed. Jake clenched his fists. Here we go again. But before he could argue, the priestess raised her hand. No, he fights. He kills. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The leader sneered. The sky fallen before him failed. Jake took a step forward, meeting the leader's glare head-on. Yeah. Well, maybe he didn't have a plan. The leader laughed. A plan. Against a god. Jake folded his arms. Not a god. Just a big, dumb monster. That got their attention. The warriors murmured amongst themselves. The idea of killing the gorgal had never crossed their minds before. The priestess turned to them. We do not run. We do not hide. We end this. Jake saw the hesitation in their faces. They wanted to believe. But fear ran deep. So he played his last card. Look, he said, I know what it's like to be hunted. But the way I see it, you've got two options. Wait for that thing to pick you off one by one, or fight like hell. Silence. Then, a single warrior stepped forward. Then another. Then another. Jake exhaled. It was time to prepare for war. The plan. Over the next few hours, the village transformed into a fortress. Jake gathered everything he could salvage from his wrecked ship. Fuel canisters, flares, emergency explosives. If they were going to kill the gorgal, they had to think smart. Meanwhile, the warriors worked fast, digging deep pits, reinforcing walls, sharpening massive wooden spears. Jake wiped sweat from his brow as he adjusted a makeshift detonator. He wasn't a soldier, but he sure as hell knew how to improvise. The priestess approached. It will return soon. Jake nodded. Good. Let's make sure it doesn't leave. She studied him, her golden eyes intense. Why do you fight? Jake hesitated. He could say it was for survival, or because he had no choice. But instead he shrugged. Because I can. Something shifted in her gaze. For the first time, she almost smiled. Then the ground trembled again. A long, earth-shaking roar filled the air. Jake turned toward the jungle. His heart pounded. It was here. The battle begins. The first scream came from the jungle's edge. A warrior stationed at a watchpoint vanished in an instant, his body dragged into the undergrowth. The gorgal burst from the trees, its massive form smashing through the reinforced barricades like twigs. But this time, the tribe did not run. Warriors threw spears, their tips coated in poison. The gorgal roared in fury as one spear pierced its thick hide. But it wasn't enough. It swiped a warrior aside, sending him crashing into a hut. Jake clenched his jaw. "Come on, you ugly bastard." Then the trap was sprung. The beast charged, stepping onto the pit, and the ground collapsed beneath it. The warriors cheered as the beast fell into the deep hole, landing hard on the sharpened stakes below. But Jake's blood ran cold. The gorgal wasn't dead. It snarled, its massive claws digging into the dirt walls, pulling itself up. Jake grabbed the detonator. He only had one shot. He flicked the switch. Boom. The fuel canisters ignited, fire erupting from the pit like an inferno. The gorgal let out a monstrous roar, thrashing wildly. Jake gritted his teeth. "Stay down, you bastard." The flames consumed the pit, and for a moment, it seemed like they had won. Then, a single, clawed hand reached up over the edge. Jake's heart stopped. The gorgal was still alive. A plan to kill a god. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. The pit was still aflame, glowing with an eerie orange light. Warriors stood at the edges, gripping their spears, eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Jake stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The gorgal's massive, clawed hand gripped the edge of the pit. Its blackened, burnt hide cracked and smoldered, but it still moved. It still lived. That's not possible," Jake whispered. The priestess stood beside him, her face pale. "It is worse than I feared." The tribal leader snarled, "We should have sacrificed the outsider. This is his curse." Jake ignored him. His mind was racing. They had thrown everything at the beast. Poisoned spears, traps, explosives. Any normal creature would be dead. But the gorgal wasn't normal. It was something else. The beast let out a deep, guttural growl, pulling itself up with terrifying strength. Its glowing golden eyes burned with rage. Half its face was melted, revealing sharp bone beneath, but it didn't seem to feel pain. Then it roared. The force shattered the wooden barricades around the pit. The warriors staggered back, gripping their weapons tighter. But Jake knew they were out of options. If they stayed, they would die. All of them. Jake turned to the priestess. "We need a new plan. Now." She clenched her jaw, her golden markings flickering. "There is only one way." Jake exhaled sharply. "Let me guess. It's insane." She met his gaze. "Yes." The final plan. Inside the great stone hut, the surviving warriors gathered. Their faces were grim, their bodies tired and wounded. Some carried spears snapped in half, others had deep claw wounds. The village had already lost too many. They didn't have another battle left in them. Jake stood in the center, staring at the primitive map carved into the stone floor. It showed the jungle, the village, and something else. A ravine. An old canyon, miles away, with jagged, deadly cliffs. Jake looked up at the priestess. "You want to lure it there?" She nodded. "The gorgal is strong, but even it cannot survive the depths." The tribal leader scoffed. "We do not run from gods." Jake slammed his fist against the stone table. "It's not a god. It's a beast. And beasts die." The warriors exchanged uncertain glances. Jake softened his voice. "Look, I get it. You've lived in fear of this thing your whole lives. But we have one chance to end this. Forever." He stepped closer to the warriors. "You saw it crawl out of the fire. You know we can't kill it with spears." Silence. Then, slowly, one warrior nodded. Then another. The priestess gave Jake a small nod of approval. "Then we moved before dawn." Jake exhaled. It was time. The deadly chase. The village was silent when they set the plan in motion. Jake and the warriors spread out, lighting torches and making noise. The gorgal was a predator. It would follow movement. Jake stood in the open, holding a flare gun from his crashed ship. His last flare. He raised it. Fired. The bright red light shot into the sky, burning against the darkness. The gorgal's head snapped toward him. Its muscles tensed, its jaws opened. Then, with a monstrous snarl, it charged. Jake turned and ran. Behind him, trees splintered as the beast tore through the jungle, moving faster than anything that they had a right to. Branches whipped against Jake's arms, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the warriors running alongside him, leading the beast toward the ravine. The ground began to change. Drier, rockier. They were close. Jake's lungs burned. "Come on, come on." Then, suddenly, the ground vanished beneath them. The cliff's edge. Jake skidded to a stop, pebbles crumbling beneath his feet. The ravine stretched out before him. A massive, gaping chasm, its depths shrouded in blackness. The warriors peeled off, taking cover in the rocks. But Jake stood his ground. He turned. The gorgal was coming. It did not stop. It did not slow down. It charged forward, massive claws tearing up the ground, teeth bared. Jake waited until the last second. Then, he jumped to the side. For a brief, perfect moment, the beast's momentum carried it over the edge. Jake could see its eyes widen. Then, it plunged into the abyss. The final moment. Silence. Then, a deep, earth-shaking crash echoed through the canyon. The beast was gone. Jake lay on the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. His breath was ragged. His heart thundered. The warriors slowly emerged from the shadows, staring down into the ravine. Then, one by one, they raised their weapons and shouted, a victory cry. The gorgal was dead. The nightmare was over. The priestess stood beside Jake, looking down at the canyon. Her voice was quiet. "You have done what no one else could." Jake let out a weak laugh. "Yeah. Let's never do that again." The tribal leader stepped forward, his pride wounded, but his voice clear. "You are not prey," he said. He dropped to one knee. The warriors followed. Jake blinked. "But is this a new eat me ceremony?" "Because." The priestess smirked. "No, they honor you." Jake looked around at the kneeling warriors, the tribe that had once feared him, now bowing to him. He exhaled. "Well," he muttered, rubbing his sore ribs, "that's new." Betrayal and battle. The dust hadn't settled. The echoes of the gorgal's fall still rumbled through the deep ravine like a ghostly whisper. Jake stood near the edge, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. It was over. The beast was gone. The warriors cheered, raising their weapons to the sky, their voices blending into a victory cry that shook the air. They had done it. They had killed a god. Or so Jake thought. The priestess stood still, her glowing golden eyes fixed on the abyss below. Something was wrong. Jake stepped closer to her. "Hey," he said between breaths, "you okay?" She didn't answer. Then, the ground trembled. Jake's stomach dropped. The warriors' cheers died. The earth cracked beneath their feet, and suddenly, from the darkness of the ravine, a single, massive claw rose up. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "No, no way," he whispered. The gorgal was still alive. The unstoppable nightmare. The warriors stumbled back, their faces twisting in terror as the beast pulled itself up from the abyss. Half of its armored hide was missing, burned away from the explosion. Its left eye was gone, a hollow, charred socket. One of its massive horns was snapped, jagged and raw. But it did not stop. It did not die. The gorgal roared, louder than before, louder than anything Jake had ever heard. The force shattered the ground beneath them. The warriors panicked. Jake acted fast. "Move E," he shouted, pushing the priestess away as the ground collapsed beneath them. The remaining ledge crumbled, sending rocks and bodies tumbling. Warriors scrambled for safety, but some weren't fast enough. The gorgal lunged, its claws tearing through stone, climbing out of its supposed grave. Jake's mind raced. How? How was it still alive? Then he saw it. Deep within the beast's chest, where it should have had a heart, something glowed. A pulsing, golden core, beating like a second heart. Jake clenched his jaw. That's why it won't die. The gorgal wasn't just flesh and blood. It was something more. Betrayal in the ranks. As the warriors regrouped, the tribal leader stepped forward, his face twisted in anger and desperation. "This is your fault," he bellowed at Jake. Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "Oh, sure, blame the guy who led the monster off a cliff." The leader wasn't listening. He turned to his warriors. "The gods are angry. The outsider must be given to the beast." Jake's stomach dropped. Oh, hell no. The warriors hesitated. Some glanced at the priestess. Some lowered their weapons. But others still feared the gorgal. And fear made them dangerous. Before Jake could react, two warriors grabbed him from behind, twisting his arms back. Jake struggled, but they were strong. "Are you insane? We're in the middle of a..." The priestess stepped forward, her expression dark. "Release him." The leader sneered. "You would defy our gods." The priestess raised her hand, and suddenly her golden markings flared brighter than ever. The warriors stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the sudden glow. The priestess' entire body radiated energy, her voice booming through the clearing. "I do not defy the gods," she said. "I speak for them." The warriors froze, their grip on Jake loosening. Then the gorgal moved again. The massive beast charged, knocking over trees and sending warriors flying. Jake ripped himself free from his captors and turned to the priestess. "You've got a plan, right?" She locked eyes with him. "Yes." Jake exhaled sharply. "Good. I was really hoping you'd say that." The final stand. The warriors, shaken but still standing, prepared for the final battle. Jake turned to them. "We finish this. No more running." The tribal leader, humbled by his own cowardice, clenched his jaw. "How?" Jake pointed to the glowing core in the gorgal's chest. "We hit that." The warriors moved fast, circling the beast. Some climbed the trees, others grabbed the last of their fire-tipped spears. Jake turned to the priestess. "Whatever power you have, use it." She nodded, her golden tattoos blazing like fire. Then the gorgal attacked. It swiped with its massive claws, but warriors dodged and struck. Jake ran through the chaos, dodging debris, his eyes locked on the beating golden core in the beast's chest. Come on, come on." Then a warrior leaped from a tree, spear in hand, and drove it into the core. The gorgal howled in pain, its massive body staggering. Jake saw his opening. He grabbed one of his last explosives from his belt, the emergency energy cell from his crashed ship. The thing was unstable. It would explode on impact. Jake sprinted forward, leaping onto the beast's massive clawed foot, using it as a launch pad. The gorgal snapped its head toward him, its one remaining eye blazing. Jake threw the energy cell directly at the core. The priestess shouted a final word, and her golden light merged with the explosion. Boom! The end of the gorgal. The blast was blinding. A massive shockwave tore through the jungle, knocking everyone off their feet. Jake hit the ground hard, rolling through the dirt. His ears rang. The air was thick with smoke. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a massive thud. The gorgal's body collapsed, its golden core shattered, its monstrous chest caved in. The ground shook one last time. Then, silence. The gorgal was dead. Jake lay on the ground, staring at the sky, his body aching. Then he laughed. A weak, tired, relieved laugh. The priestess limped to his side. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his chest. "It is over." Jake let out a long breath. "You sure? No final monster roar? No one last jump scare?" The priestess shook her head, a rare hint of amusement in her eyes. "No." Jake sighed. "Good." He closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he finally let himself rest. A new legend is born. The battle was over. The gorgal lay still, its monstrous body sprawled across the battlefield, the once glowing core in its chest, now a shattered, lifeless husk. The ground was scorched, trees broken and smoldering, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt flesh and victory. But no one spoke. The warriors, bloodied and exhausted, stood frozen, staring at the beast they had spent generations fearing. And now, it was dead. Jake lay on his back, staring up at the alien sky, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. He was too tired to move, too sore to celebrate. The priestess knelt beside him, placing a hand on his chest. "It is done," she whispered. Jake let out a weak chuckle. "Yeah." No surprise second form. No one last roar. She shook her head. "No." Jake sighed. "Good. I'd hate to have to kill this thing a third time." The warriors began to murmur, some stepping forward cautiously, weapons still in hand, as if expecting the beast to rise again. But it didn't. The tribal leader, the same man who had once called for Jake's sacrifice, now stood among his people, silent, shaken, humbled. Finally, he took a step forward, then another. He stopped at the gorgal's massive, lifeless head, staring into its dead, hollow eye. And then, he dropped to one knee. The warriors followed, one by one, lowering themselves in reverence, not to the beast, but to the man who had slain it. Jake blinked. "Oh, what's happening?" The priestess smirked slightly. "They'd bow to the one who has done what no warrior before could." Jake stared at the entire village kneeling before him, eyes wide. "You've got to be kidding me." The celebration of a warrior. Night fell, and the village was alive again, but not with fear, with celebration. Fires blazed high, torches illuminating the massive remains of the gorgal in the village square. Warriors danced around it, chanting, singing, telling the story of the battle. The story of the human who slayed the god of the jungle. Jake sat on a large stone, rubbing his sore arm as a warrior pressed a crude metal armband into his hand. "For the champion," the warrior said gruffly before walking away. Jake turned to the priestess. "Am I actually supposed to wear this?" She nodded. "You are honored now. You wear the mark of a warrior." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So, what? I'm part of the tribe now." The priestess tilted her head, considering. "Perhaps." Jake exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. "Not exactly how I pictured first contact with an alien race." She smirked. "And yet you live." Jake chuckled, but before he could say anything else, something caught his eye. A warrior sat alone, sharpening a blade, one of the few who had opposed him. Jake's smirk faded. "They won't all accept me, will they?" The priestess followed his gaze. "Some will not." Jake nodded slowly. "Guess I'll have to deal with that later." He leaned back, watching the firelight flicker against the massive corpse of the gorgal. It really was over. But even as the village celebrated, something gnawed at the back of Jake's mind. Something the priestess had said before. The last human who came here failed. He frowned, glancing at her. "Hey, that other Skyfallen. The one before me. What happened to him?" The priestess's expression darkened. Jake sat up. "He didn't die to the gorgal, did he?" She hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. No. Jake's pulse spiked. Then where is he? The priestess turned her eyes to the far side of the jungle, where the fires didn't reach. Jake followed her gaze. Deep beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows, something moved. Something watching. A chill ran down his spine. The gorgal was dead, but his real fight was just beginning. The beginning of something bigger. As the village rejoiced, Jake sat alone at the edge of the firelight, staring into the darkness. The priestess sat beside him. You do not celebrate. Jake exhaled. I should, but something doesn't feel right. She nodded, because it is not over. Jake looked at her. What aren't you telling me? The priestess hesitated, then finally said, You are not the first, but you may be the last. A shiver ran through him. Last for what? She held his gaze, and her next words sent a cold chill through his veins. For the war to come. Jake swallowed hard. What war? She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly rose and extended her hand. Jake stared at it, then at the shadows beyond the jungle. He had come to this world by accident. Now, it seemed, he had a purpose, a choice, a destiny. With a deep breath, he took her hand and stepped into the unknown.